Their first glimpse of a human battleship, that was the moment they realized they wouldn't survive. The Varinthian Concorde had ruled a large piece of the galaxy for almost 9,000 years. In that long stretch of time, the Concorde had fought many wars. It had won every single one of them. Its ships were fast, its weapons were strong, and its soldiers, the Voraki, were bred and trained for war from the moment they hatched. No species that the Concorde had ever met could stand against them for long. Some species surrendered before the first shot was fired, just from seeing the size of a Voraki fleet. Others fought bravely and still lost within a few weeks. The Concorde had grown used to winning. Winning was simply what happened. It was not something they had to think about anymore. This is why, when the first reports came in about a new species called the Terrans, nobody in the Concorde took them seriously. The reports were strange from the very beginning. A long-range scout drone, patrolling the far edge of Concorde space, had picked up faint radio signals coming from a system nobody had explored before. The signals were old, some of them thousands of years old, drifting through space like echoes. They were full of strange sounds, music, voices, numbers being counted, a woman speaking calmly about weather. None of it made any sense to the drone's translation systems at first, but slowly, over the weeks that followed, the Concorde's linguists began to piece together a language. They called the species Terran because the drone had also picked up a name the species used for their homeworld, Earth. At first, the discovery caused a small amount of excitement in the Concorde's science division. A new species, previously unknown, tucked away in a quiet corner of the galaxy. That was rare. Most of the galaxy had already been mapped and catalogued. But the excitement did not last long, because when the science division looked closer, the Terrans did not seem impressive at all. Their homeworld had a single moon. Their technology, as far as anyone could tell from old broadcasts, seemed to be limited to simple machines, basic flight, and weapons that used chemical explosions rather than energy weapons or plasma. There was no sign of faster-than-light travel. There was no sign of any real space presence at all, other than a handful of old satellites and a few crumbling stations that no longer sent signals. The report that went to the Concorde Council was short and almost boring to read. It said in simple terms that the Terrans were a young, low-technology species, likely still confined to their home system, and posed no threat to Concorde interests. The report recommended that a survey team be sent, at some point in the future, to make first contact and decide whether the species was worth inviting into the lower ranks of the Concorde. There was no urgency attached to the recommendation. It was filed away with hundreds of other reports about minor species scattered across unclaimed space. Nobody thought about the Terrans again for almost 11 years. It was Fleet Commander Sarn Kovith who brought them back into the light. Kovith was a senior officer of the Voraki military, a veteran of 3 border wars and 1 large campaign against a species called the Hollow Wing, a winged race that had resisted Concorde expansion for nearly a century before finally being crushed. Kovith had commanded a strike group during that war, and had earned a reputation as a careful, patient commander who did not take unnecessary risks. He was not the kind of officer who liked surprises. He liked plans, and he liked those plans to work exactly as expected. Kovith was assigned to the edge of Concorde space, overseeing the slow expansion of Concorde territory into a region called the Ashlight Reach, a wide stretch of mostly empty stars that the Concorde had been quietly absorbing for the past several decades. It was during this expansion that one of his survey ships, a small vessel called the 11th, went missing. The 11th had been mapping a cluster of systems near the edge of the Reach, close to where Concorde territory bordered on unclaimed space. It sent regular reports back to Kovith's flagship every few days. Then, one day, the reports stopped. At first, Kovith assumed the ship had suffered some kind of mechanical failure. Ships broke down sometimes, especially older survey vessels that spent long periods far from any repair station. He sent a message asking the crew to report their status. There was no answer. He waited 2 more days and sent another message. Still no answer. On the 5th day of silence, Kovith ordered a second ship, a light cruiser called the Vantressa, to travel to the 11th's last known position and investigate. The Vantressa found the 11th drifting dead in space. The survey ship had not suffered a mechanical failure. It had been destroyed. Not blown apart the way a weapon would destroy a ship, but disabled, its systems burned out from the inside. its hull scorched in places by something that had clearly been very hot and very precise. The crew were all dead. There were no signs of boarding, no signs of a battle in the traditional sense. It looked, according to the report the Van Tressa's captain sent back to Koveth, as though something had simply reached out, touched the ship once, and turned it off forever. Koveth read that report 3 times before he fully understood what it meant. Someone out here had a weapon the Concorde had never seen before, and they had used it to destroy one of his ships without any warning at all. He requested an investigation from Concorde Military Intelligence, and it was during that investigation that someone finally connected the location of the 11th's destruction to the old survey data about the Terrans. The system where the 11th had died was close to the edge of the region the Terrans had marked, in their old radio broadcasts, as their own territory. Koveth did not believe it at first. A species that 11 years ago had been flying primitive chemical rockets could not possibly have a weapon capable of doing what had been done to the 11th. It made no sense. He assumed there was some other explanation, perhaps a pirate group, perhaps some unknown third species nobody had catalogued yet. He requested updated survey data on the Terrans before drawing any conclusions. The updated data, when it came in, troubled him even more than the destroyed ship had. There had been almost no new radio signals from the Terran system in the past several years, where before there had been a steady stream of broadcasts, chatter, music, and noise leaking out into space. Now there was almost nothing. It was as if the species had gone quiet on purpose. Concorde intelligence officers debated what this meant. Some believed the Terrans had simply advanced beyond the need for the kind of broadcasts that leaked into space, moving to more focused communication methods. Others believed something else entirely, something that made a few of the older analysts uneasy, in a way they could not quite explain. Koveth did not have the patience for debate. He wanted facts. He requested permission from the Concorde Council to send a proper scouting mission into Terran space, not just a lone survey ship, but a small squadron with escorts, capable of investigating thoroughly and defending itself if needed. The Council, more curious than concerned, approved the request within a week. The ship chosen to lead the mission was the HFY, a scout cruiser under the command of a younger officer named Doran Yesh, accompanied by 2 smaller escort vessels. Koveth would remain behind at the border, coordinating from a distance, but he made sure Yesh understood exactly what was expected of him. "You are not there to start a war," Koveth told him, during their final briefing before the HFY departed. "You are there to look, and to listen, and to come back and tell me what you saw. If you find evidence of hostile action, you are to withdraw immediately and report. Do you understand?" Yesh, eager and a little too confident for Koveth's taste, said that he understood completely. The HFY left the border 3 days later, moving quietly toward the edge of what the old data called Terran space. It took the ship almost 2 weeks to reach the outer edge of the system. As they got closer, Yesh's crew began picking up faint signals again, though these were different from the old broadcasts the Concorde had recorded over a decade earlier. These signals were tight, focused, clearly meant to be received by specific targets, rather than leaking out into open space. The HFY's communications officer, a young Voraki named Pelik, spent hours trying to decode fragments of the signals, but they used encryption methods far more advanced than anything the old broadcasts had shown. This alone should have been a warning. A species does not simply learn to encrypt its communications like this in a few short years, unless something has changed dramatically. But Yesh, driven by curiosity and the desire to bring back an impressive report, pressed forward anyway. 3 days after entering the outer edge of the system, the HFY's sensors picked up something drifting alone in space. It was small, roughly the size of one of the Concorde's own long-range buoys, silent and unmoving. Yesh ordered the ship to approach and scan it. As they got closer, the object activated. It was not a weapon, it was a beacon, and it began broadcasting a message the moment the HFY came within range. The message repeated over and over, first in a language nobody aboard understood, and then, to the crew's surprise, in a rough but understandable version of the Voraki tongue, clearly assembled by some kind of translation system working from limited data. The message was simple. It said that the ship had entered a restricted boundary belonging to the United Terran Defense Authority. It said that any vessel that continued past this point without prior authorization would be treated as a hostile threat. It gave a set of coordinates for a designated contact point, far outside the boundary, where any ship wishing to communicate with Terran authorities could wait for a response. Then the message simply repeated itself again from the beginning. Pellic reported the message to Yesh immediately, and for a moment, the bridge of the Ashvalin was quiet. This was not the kind of message a primitive species sent. This was the kind of message a species sent when it had already fought wars, already lost ships, already learned the hard way that warnings needed to be clear and simple, so that nobody could claim later they had not understood. Yesh considered turning back. He genuinely did, for almost a full hour, weighing Koveth's orders in his mind. But the beacon's message had also told him something valuable, something he had been sent to find out. It confirmed that the Terrans had a working boundary, a working defense authority, and a working translation of the Voraki language, which meant they had likely encountered or at least monitored other species before. That alone was worth bringing back to Koveth. Surely, Yesh told himself, a small scouting mission to look a little further inside the boundary, staying well outside of what appeared to be any obvious defensive position, would not count as a genuine act of aggression. He was not there to attack. He was there to look. He gave the order to continue forward, but slower this time, and with sensors at full alert. The Ashvalin and its 2 escorts crossed the boundary marked by the beacon 3 hours later. Nothing happened immediately. The ships continued forward for almost a full day without incident, their sensors sweeping the space around them for any sign of activity. They picked up traces of old debris fields, the remains of what looked like decades-old space stations, some of them clearly destroyed in some kind of past conflict rather than simply abandoned. Pellic noted this in his logs, uneasy, but Yesh remained focused on pressing forward toward the system's inner planets, where the strongest signals seemed to be originating. It was on the second day inside the boundary that the Ashvalin's sensors detected a small craft approaching them. It was tiny compared to the Ashvalin, barely larger than a single-person fighter, moving with a speed and precision that immediately caught the attention of the ship's tactical officer. It did not attempt to hide itself. It approached openly, broadcasting a short identification code, and then took up a position roughly 10,000 kilometers off the Ashvalin's port side, matching its speed exactly and holding there. Yesh ordered his crew to hail the craft. There was no response, other than the identification code repeating itself. For almost 6 hours, the small craft simply followed alongside the Ashvalin, keeping its distance, watching. Yesh's crew grew increasingly nervous, though Yesh himself tried to appear calm on the bridge, insisting that the craft was likely just a scout drone of some kind, gathering information the same way the Ashvalin itself was. Then, without warning, the small craft accelerated and closed the distance to the Ashvalin in under 4 seconds. The bridge crew barely had time to react. Weapons officers scrambled to bring the Ashvalin's defensive systems online, but before they could fire a single shot, the small craft released something, a compact device that struck the Ashvalin's outer hull near its main sensor array and detonated in a small, controlled explosion. It was not enough to seriously damage the ship, but it was more than enough to destroy the sensor array completely, blinding the Ashvalin's long-range detection systems in an instant. The small craft then peeled away, accelerating back toward the direction it had come from, disappearing from what remained of the ship's short-range sensors within seconds. The bridge was in chaos for several minutes as the crew worked to assess the damage and bring backup systems online. Yesh, shaken but trying to keep his composure, ordered the ship to withdraw immediately, exactly as Koveth had instructed him to do if they encountered evidence of hostile action. As the Ashvalin and its 2 escorts began their retreat, another message arrived, broadcast on the same frequency as the beacon they had passed days earlier. This one was shorter. It said only this: "You were warned once. You will not be warned again. Leave, and do not return without authorization, or the next response will not be a warning." Yesh ordered the ships to accelerate to maximum speed, and the small squadron fled back across the boundary and out of Terran space, arriving back at the Concord border 11 days later, badly shaken, having lost their primary sensor array and, more importantly, having lost their confidence entirely. When Koveth received Yesh's full report, he sat with it for a long time before responding to anyone. The destruction of the 11th had troubled him. The Ashvalin's encounter troubled him even more. A single small craft, likely automated given how quickly and precisely it had acted, had crippled a Concorde scout cruiser without firing a single traditional weapon, using a small, controlled device to disable exactly the system it needed to disable, and nothing more. This was not the work of a primitive species. This was not even the work of an average species within the Concorde's own ranks. This was precise, disciplined, and, most worrying of all, restrained. Whoever had sent that small craft could clearly have destroyed the Ashvelin entirely if they had wanted to. They had chosen not to. Koveth requested an emergency meeting with the Concorde Council to present his findings and request authorization for a full military response. He did not yet know how right he was to be worried, or how much the small skirmish at the edge of Terran space was about to change everything the Concorde believed about its place in the galaxy. He also did not yet know that, deep within Terran territory, a very different conversation was taking place, one where a group of tired, grim-faced human officers were looking at the reports of 2 Concorde incursions in less than a month, and reaching a very different conclusion than Koveth's superiors would ever have expected. They were not afraid. They were preparing. Koveth's request for an emergency meeting was granted, though not as quickly as he had hoped. The Concorde Council was a large body, made up of representatives from dozens of member species, and it did not move quickly for anything short of a full-scale invasion. Koveth waited 9 days before he was finally given a slot to present his findings, and by then he had grown even more impatient than usual. The meeting took place in the council chamber on Voraki Prime, a wide circular room built to hold representatives from every corner of the Concorde. Koveth stood at the center of the room, a holographic display floating beside him, showing the last known scans of the 11th's wreckage and the damaged sensor array from the Ashvelin. He spoke plainly, the way he always did, laying out the facts without exaggeration. 2 incidents, he said. 2 ships damaged or destroyed. Both incidents occurred inside or near the boundary marked by the Terran species. Both incidents show a level of precision and restraint that suggests deliberate, controlled action, not an accident, and not a primitive defense system reacting blindly. One of the council members, an older representative from a species called the Dren, a slow-moving, heavily armored race, known for their caution in all things, raised a concern that many others in the room seemed to share. Commander Koveth, the survey from 11 years ago, described this species as having no faster-than-light capability and no significant space presence. How do you reconcile that report with what you are telling us now? Koveth had expected this question. I cannot reconcile it, he admitted. The 2 reports do not match. Either the original survey was deeply flawed, or the Terran species has advanced at a pace unlike anything the Concorde has seen before. I believe we need a full investigation before we draw further conclusions, and I believe that investigation should include a proper military presence, not another lone scout ship. The council debated for hours. Some members argued that the incidents were minor, that a single destroyed survey ship and a damaged sensor array did not justify a military response, and that diplomacy should be attempted first. Others, more aligned with Koveth's thinking, argued that the Concorde could not afford to look weak by simply accepting these losses without any response at all. If word spread that a young, uncatalogued species had successfully struck 2 Concorde vessels without consequence, other minor species along the border might begin to question the Concorde's strength. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Council authorized a larger fleet, not a full invasion force, but a strong escort group of 6 warships under Koveth's own command, to travel to the edge of Terran space, attempt formal diplomatic contact using the coordinates given in the beacon's message, and, if contact failed or if further hostile action was taken, to respond with appropriate force. Koveth accepted the mission without hesitation. He wanted answers, and he intended to get them himself this time, rather than relying on someone else's report. It took nearly 2 months to assemble the fleet and prepare it for the journey. Koveth used the time carefully. He requested every scrap of information the Concorde had ever gathered on Earth, going back to the very first faint radio signals detected over a decade earlier. He had his intelligence officers comb through the old broadcasts again, this time looking specifically for anything related to conflict, to war, to weapons, rather than the music and casual conversation that had caught the attention of the original survey team. What they found unsettled him more than anything else had. Buried within the old broadcasts, mixed in with the music and the calm weather reports, were fragments of something else entirely. News broadcasts, decades old by the time the signals had reached Concord space, describing wars fought between different groups of Terrans themselves. Wars that had killed tens of millions of their own people. Descriptions of weapons capable of destroying entire cities in a single strike. References to something called a Cold War, a decades-long standoff between two powerful groups of Terrans, each one holding enough destructive power to end most life on their homeworld many times over, and neither one ever using it, out of fear of what the other would do in return. Koveth read through the translated fragments late into the night, alone in his private quarters aboard his flagship, the Voranthe. He had fought against violent species before. He had led fleets against enemies who fought with genuine ferocity, who did not surrender easily, who sometimes fought to the very last soldier rather than accept defeat. But he had never encountered a species whose own history was this violent, this relentless, and who had still managed to survive it, generation after generation, without destroying themselves entirely. He began to wonder, quietly, whether the survey conducted 11 years ago had missed something important. Not because the survey had been careless, but because the Terrans, even then, in those old broadcasts full of music and weather reports, had already been a species shaped by an almost unbelievable amount of conflict. A species like that did not stay primitive for long, once it decided that survival required something more. Koveth kept these thoughts to himself for the most part, sharing only the barest details with his senior officers. He did not want to spread fear or hesitation through his fleet before they had even left Concord space. But privately, he began to prepare for the mission differently than he had originally planned. He ordered additional defensive drills. He reviewed evacuation and retreat procedures with each of his ship captains personally, something he rarely bothered to do before a mission that was, officially, supposed to be a diplomatic one. Far across the stars, inside the boundary the Terrans had drawn around their territory, a very different set of preparations were already well underway, and they had been underway for a long time before Koveth's fleet ever left Voraki Prime. The destruction of the 11th and the crippling of the Ashvelin sensors had not been treated as isolated incidents by the humans who oversaw the boundary. They had been treated as exactly what they were, the first probing steps of an unknown alien power testing the edges of human territory. And the people responsible for defending that boundary had spent the better part of 2 decades preparing for precisely this moment. Deep within a heavily fortified command station, orbiting a planet the humans called New Ceres, a woman named Admiral Renata Ibarra sat in a briefing room, reviewing the reports from the Ashvelin encounter for what felt like the 100th time. She was not a young officer. She had seen the earliest days of humanity's expansion into space, had lived through the years when Earth itself had come closer to annihilation than most of its population would ever fully understand, and she had spent the better part of her career making absolutely certain that such a thing would never be allowed to happen again. Beside her sat Captain Elias Marrow, commanding officer of a vessel that very few people outside the highest levels of the Terran Defense Authority even knew existed. Marrow was a quiet man, calm in a way that unsettled people who did not know him well, and he listened carefully as Ibarra laid out what they knew about the alien fleet gathering on the other side of the boundary. 6 warships, Ibarra said, gesturing to a display showing long-range sensor data gathered from a network of hidden monitoring stations scattered along the edge of human territory. Larger than anything we've seen from them before, moving slowly, deliberately. They're not trying to hide their approach. They want us to see them coming, Marrow said. That's my read as well, Ibarra agreed. A show of strength before they even try to talk to us. Standard first contact posture for a species that's used to winning without much of a fight. Marrow studied the display for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And if talking doesn't work? Ibarra was quiet for a moment before she answered. Then it stops being a show, Captain, and I think it's time the Dauntless earned her name. Marrow nodded slowly, and somewhere far behind him, docked in a hidden shipyard that no alien sensor had ever managed to detect, a vessel far larger than anything the Concorde had ever built waited quietly in the dark, its systems slowly coming to life for the first time in years. The Concorde fleet, still weeks away from the boundary, had no idea what was waiting for them. Fleet Commander Sarn Koveth's fleet crossed into what the beacon had called Terran space, almost 3 weeks after leaving the border. 6 warships moving in tight formation, their sensors sweeping the darkness ahead of them for any sign of activity. Kovith stood on the bridge of the Voranthe, watching the empty stars slide past, feeling a tightness in his chest that he did not remember feeling before any of his previous campaigns. He told himself it was simply caution. A commander who had read what he had read about the Terrans, who had learned what little the Concord now knew about their bloody, relentless history, would be a fool not to feel some tension approaching their territory. He reminded himself, more than once during those 3 weeks, that his orders were to attempt diplomatic contact first. He was not here to start a war. He was here to understand what he was dealing with, and only to respond with force, if force was used against him first. The fleet reached the same beacon that the Ashvelin had encountered months earlier, still drifting quietly in space, still broadcasting the same warning it had broadcast before. Kovith had his communications officer respond this time, using the coordinates the beacon provided, requesting a formal diplomatic meeting between Concord and Terran representatives. The response took almost 18 hours to arrive, an agonizing wait for a fleet used to instant communication within Concord space. When it finally came, it was short and direct. A Terran representative would meet with Concord representatives at a location just inside the boundary, a small, uninhabited system with nothing but a dim red star and a scattering of rocky, lifeless planets. The message specified that only 2 Concord vessels would be permitted to approach the meeting point, and that any additional ships found within a certain distance of the location would be treated as a violation of the agreement. Kovith considered the terms carefully. Bringing only 2 ships to a meeting deep inside enemy territory went against every instinct he had as a military commander. But refusing the terms would mean abandoning the mission entirely, returning to the Concord with nothing more than he already had. After consulting with his senior officers, he decided to proceed, though he ordered the remaining 4 ships of his fleet to hold position just outside the specified boundary, ready to respond quickly if anything went wrong. The Voranthe and 1 escort ship, the Kelmith, moved forward toward the meeting point. They arrived at the dim red star system 2 days later. For the first several hours there was nothing. Empty space, the dim red light of the dying star casting long shadows across the barren rocky planets below. Kovith's crew grew restless, wondering if the meeting had been some kind of trick, a way to lure 2 Concord ships away from the safety of the larger fleet. Then, without any warning at all, sensors detected a single vessel entering the system. It was small, far smaller than either the Voranthe or the Kelmith. It approached slowly, deliberately, its running lights clearly visible even at a distance, making no attempt to hide its approach. When it came within communication range, a single video transmission opened on the Voranthe's bridge. The person on the screen was human. Kovith had seen images of humans before, gathered from old broadcasts, but seeing one in real time, speaking directly to him, was different. She was an older woman, gray hair pulled back neatly, wearing a simple gray uniform with no obvious markings of rank that Kovith could identify. Her expression was calm, almost bored, the kind of expression Kovith had seen on veteran officers who had long ago stopped being impressed by shows of military strength. "Fleet Commander Kovith," she said, her voice translated a moment later by the Voranthe's systems into passable Voraki. "I am Ambassador Priya Nandan, representing the United Terran Defense Authority. Thank you for agreeing to the terms of this meeting." Kovith introduced himself formally, and the conversation that followed lasted almost 3 hours. Nandan asked pointed, careful questions about the Concord's intentions, about why Concord ships had entered Terran space without authorization not once but twice, and about what the Concord hoped to gain from continued contact. Kovith answered as honestly as he was permitted to, explaining the Concord's standard practice of surveying, and eventually contacting new species, and expressing regret, though not quite an apology, for the loss of the 11th's crew. Nandan listened without much visible reaction. When Kovith finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "Commander, I want to be direct with you, because I think diplomatic games will waste both of our time," she said. "Humanity has a long history of underestimating threats, and an equally long history of paying dearly for it. We do not intend to repeat those mistakes with your Concord. Every incursion into our territory will be met with a response proportional to what we believe the threat requires. The 11th was destroyed, because it entered a heavily monitored zone without authorization and did not respond to repeated warnings. The Ashvelin was disabled, not destroyed, because our automated systems determined it posed a lower immediate threat and chose restraint. I want you to understand that restraint was a choice, not a limitation. Koveth felt something cold settle in his stomach at those words, though he kept his expression neutral. And what would you require from the Concord ambassador to avoid further incidents of this kind? A clear, verifiable boundary agreement, Nandan said. Full disclosure of any future Concord vessels entering the region near our territory, in advance, with specific flight paths and purposes stated, and an understanding, shared by your council, that humanity does not intend to join your Concord, does not intend to become a member species under your authority, and expects to be treated as a fully independent power, not as a lesser species awaiting eventual absorption. It was the last part of her statement that struck Koveth the hardest. The Concord had never, in its long history, treated any newly contacted species as anything other than a future member, whether that species agreed willingly or was eventually persuaded through pressure and negotiation over decades. The idea that a species this young, by the Concord's own outdated estimates, would simply refuse the entire premise of Concord expansion was almost unheard of. He told Nandan that he did not have the authority to agree to such terms on behalf of the Concord Council, but that he would carry her message back faithfully and recommend that formal negotiations begin as soon as possible. Nandan accepted this, and the meeting ended cordially enough, with both sides agreeing to maintain the current boundary, while the Concord Council considered its response. As the small Terran vessel turned and departed the system, Koveth found himself staring at the empty space where it had been for a long moment, turning over everything Nandan had said in his mind. She had spoken with the calm confidence of someone who genuinely did not fear the Concord's military strength, despite representing a species with, as far as Concord records still showed, no significant space navy of its own. Either she was bluffing, projecting confidence she did not actually feel in order to negotiate from a position of strength, or she genuinely believed the Terrans had the ability to back up every word she had said. Koveth did not know which possibility troubled him more. The return journey to the border took 3 weeks, and Koveth spent much of it drafting his report to the council, trying to find a way to convey the strange mixture of unease and uncertainty he had felt during the meeting, without sounding as though he had simply been intimidated by clever words. He knew how such a report would be received by some members of the council. There were factions within Concord leadership who believed, as a matter of principle, that any species claiming independence from Concord authority needed to be shown, sooner rather than later, exactly why such claims were unwise. He was right to worry. When his report reached the council, it was met with a mixture of reactions, but the loudest voices belonged to those who saw Nandan's demands as an insult to Concord authority, rather than a reasonable position from an independent power. A representative from a species called the Krathus, one of the more militarily aggressive members of the Concord and longtime allies of the Voraki military establishment, argued forcefully that the Terrans were testing the Concord's resolve, and that any sign of hesitation now would only encourage further defiance in the future. They destroyed one of our ships and disabled another, the Krathus representative said during the council session, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. And now they demand that we treat them as equals, without offering any proof of the strength they claim to possess. This is not the behavior of a species that fears us. This is the behavior of a species that believes it can push us and suffer no consequences. If we accept these terms without response, every minor species along our border will learn the same lesson. Koveth, present at the session to answer questions, found himself in the uncomfortable position of arguing for caution against a room full of officials eager for a stronger response. He reminded the council of what his own investigation into Terran history had revealed: the wars, the weapons capable of destroying entire cities, the strange, dark resilience of a species that had nearly destroyed itself many times over, and had still continued to grow stronger with each passing generation. He argued that a species with that kind of history did not make threats it could not back up, not when the cost of being wrong, for them, had always been measured in the deaths of their own people. His warnings were heard, but not fully believed. The council, after much debate, authorized a significantly larger fleet than the one Koveth had originally led, 22 warships under his continued command, to be sent back to the boundary. Officially, The mission was still described as a show of strength, meant to encourage the Terrans to accept more reasonable terms in negotiation. Unofficially, Kovith understood exactly what many members of the Council actually hoped would happen. They wanted the Terrans to see the size of the fleet arriving at their border and reconsider their demands out of simple fear. Kovith did not believe this would work, but he had exhausted his ability to argue against the decision, and a commander's duty, ultimately, was to follow the orders given to him, however much he might privately disagree with them. The fleet took almost 2 months to fully assemble and prepare, gathering warships from 3 different Voraki shipyards, along with a handful of vessels contributed by allied Krathis forces, eager to demonstrate their support for a stronger Concord response. By the time the fleet was ready to depart, it was an impressive sight, 22 warships moving in tight formation, more firepower gathered in one place than the Concord had assembled for any single mission in over a decade. Kovith stood on the bridge of the Voranthe as the fleet crossed back into Terran space, watching the same dark, empty stars he had crossed twice before, feeling the same tightness in his chest that he had felt during his first approach, though now it was joined by something closer to genuine dread. He thought often, during that long journey, about Ambassador Nandan's calm, tired expression, as she had spoken about humanity's history of underestimating threats and paying dearly for it. He wondered whether the Concord, in its confidence, was about to make exactly the same mistake she had warned him about. He did not have to wonder for very long. While the Concord fleet had spent 2 months assembling at its shipyards, a different kind of preparation had been happening on the human side of the boundary, one that Kovith and his superiors knew nothing about. Admiral Ibarra had watched the Concord's buildup through a network of hidden sensor drones scattered along the edge of human space, quiet, patient devices that gathered information and relayed it back without ever revealing their presence. She had seen the fleet grow from 6 ships to 22 over the course of 2 months, watched the reports come in day after day, and she had known, long before the fleet finally departed, exactly what kind of message the Concord was sending by assembling such a force. She called a meeting of the Terran Defense Authority's senior command staff in the same briefing room where she had first discussed the Ashvelin incident with Captain Marrow. This time, the room was fuller. Admirals, department heads, and senior analysts filled the seats around the long table, all of them studying the same sensor data that had troubled Ibarra for weeks. 22 warships, said one of the analysts, a younger officer named Deng, who had spent most of his career studying the Concord's old broadcasts and fragments of intercepted communication. That's a serious escalation from the 6 they sent to the meeting with Ambassador Nandan. If their intent was simply to negotiate, they wouldn't need this many ships. They want to scare us into accepting worse terms, Ibarra said. It's a strategy that's worked for them before, against other species. Show up with overwhelming force. Let the fear do the negotiating for you. Will it work? Asked another officer at the table, though from her tone it was clear she already suspected the answer. Ibarra allowed herself a small, humorless smile. It won't work on us, but it will tell us something important. It will tell us exactly how the Concord thinks, and exactly what kind of response they expect from a species they still believe is primitive. That's useful information, and we should use it. The room was quiet for a moment before Ibarra continued. I've reviewed the intercept course projections. Their fleet will pass through a narrow corridor of open space roughly a week before reaching the meeting point Ambassador Nandan negotiated. It's the same corridor every long-range vessel entering our territory from that direction has to pass through, because of the debris fields on either side. I think it's time we let them see exactly what they're dealing with, before they get anywhere near a system with people living in it. Captain Marrow, seated near the end of the table, finally spoke. You want to send the Dauntless alone. I want them to see one ship, Ibarra said. Not a fleet, not a show of numbers to match theirs. One ship, standing directly in their path, refusing to move. I want them to understand, from the very first moment, exactly what kind of mistake they are about to make if they choose to continue forward with hostile intent. Marrow considered this for a long moment. The Dauntless had never been deployed against a live enemy fleet before. It had been built, quietly and carefully, over the course of nearly 15 years, funded through programs that most ordinary citizens of the Terran systems had never even heard of, designed from the very beginning as a response to exactly the kind of situation humanity now found itself in. It had been tested, its weapons had been proven against simulated targets and decommissioned old hulks towed into deep space for exactly that purpose. But it had never faced a real, living enemy in real combat, and there was always a difference between simulation and reality that no amount of testing could fully account for. "If they don't stop," Marrow said quietly, "I'll need clear authorization before engaging 22 warships with a single vessel, however capable that vessel might be." Ibarra met his eyes steadily. "You'll have it, Captain. But I don't think it will come to that. I think the moment they see the Dauntless clearly, on their own sensors, at close range, they will stop being confident very quickly. Species like the Concorde build their entire military doctrine around overwhelming shows of force. They have never had to imagine what it might feel like to be on the other side of one." The meeting continued for another hour, working through logistics, communication protocols, and contingency plans, but the decision had effectively already been made. The Dauntless would depart within the week, positioning itself along the corridor the Concorde fleet was projected to pass through, and Captain Marrow would be given full authority to respond as he judged necessary, if the Concorde fleet did not heed the warning of a single human ship standing in their path. The Dauntless left its hidden shipyard 4 days later, sliding out into open space under cover of a routine supply convoy, its true size and capability masked from all but the most sophisticated sensors until it was well clear of any observation. Marrow stood on its bridge as the ship completed its final systems checks, watching his crew move through their stations with the calm efficiency of people who had trained for this exact moment for years, without ever quite believing it would come. His executive officer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Commander Aisha Tull, approached him as the final checks completed. "All systems reporting green, Captain. We're ready to make the jump to intercept position." Marrow nodded slowly, looking out at the long, dim stretch of stars ahead of them. "Let's go meet our first alien fleet, Commander." The Dauntless made the journey to the intercept corridor in just under 5 days, arriving well ahead of the Concorde fleet's projected timeline, and settled into a quiet, unmoving position at the exact center of the narrow passage between the two debris fields, its systems running at low power, waiting. 3 days after crossing the boundary, roughly a week before the Concorde fleet expected to reach the dim red star system where the previous meeting had taken place, long-range sensors detected a single contact ahead of them, moving slowly through the darkness on an intercept course. Just one ship. Kovith's tactical officer reported the contact with a note of confusion in her voice. A single vessel, approaching a fleet of 22 Concorde warships, without any apparent hesitation, without any attempt to hide or retreat. Kovith ordered the fleet to slow its approach and bring full sensors online, expecting, at first, that this might be another small scout craft, like the one that had disabled the Ashvelin months earlier. Kovith's first assumption made sense, in a way. A single small craft, matching the size of the vessel that had disabled the Ashvelin, would have fit neatly with everything the Concorde had learned about Terran tactics so far. Precise, targeted strikes from small, fast vessels, backed by automated defense systems and cautious diplomacy. It was a pattern Kovith had already built into his mental picture of how this species fought. He ordered the fleet to hold formation and continue forward at reduced speed, unwilling to let a single ship, however capable, provoke him into an aggressive response before he understood what he was truly facing. His tactical officer, a steady, experienced Voraki named Ressa Ilkarn, kept her sensors locked on the approaching contact, feeding updates to the bridge every few minutes as the distance closed. "Commander, the contact isn't changing course," Ilkarn reported. "It's holding a direct line through the corridor. Either it hasn't detected us yet, which seems unlikely given the size of our fleet, or it doesn't consider us a threat worth avoiding." "Keep tracking it," Kovith said. "Full passive sensor sweep. I want to know everything about that ship before we're close enough for it to matter." The passive sensors, designed to gather information without alerting a target to being scanned, began building a picture of the approaching vessel, piece by piece, over the following hours. At first, the readings were confusing, contradictory, as though the ship were somehow larger than its outline suggested, or as though the fleet's own instruments were malfunctioning. Ilkarn ran diagnostic checks twice, certain there had to be an error somewhere in the readings, before finally reporting back to Kovith. with a note of genuine unease in her voice that he had never heard from her before, not even during the worst days of the Hollow Wing campaign. "Commander, I don't think our instruments are wrong," she said quietly. "I think the readings are correct. I just don't understand how a single vessel can be built at that scale." Kovith felt the same tightness return to his chest that he had carried with him across 3 journeys into Terran space now, a tightness that had only grown stronger with each new piece of information he gathered about this species. He walked slowly to the tactical station himself, looking over Ilkarn's shoulder at the raw data scrolling across her display, the shape of the approaching vessel beginning to resolve, piece by piece, into something his mind did not want to accept. It was not until the sensor readings began to fully resolve, several hours later, that Kovith understood he had been wrong. The single contact ahead of them was not small. It was not small at all. By the time the Varanthe's sensors had fully resolved the shape of the approaching vessel, the entire bridge had gone silent. Officers who had spent their whole careers in Concord military service, who had seen the great shipyards of Voraki Prime, who had stood on the decks of Concord flagships built to intimidate lesser species into peaceful submission, found themselves staring at their displays without a single word to say. The ship was enormous. Kovith's own flagship, the Varanthe, was considered a large vessel by Concord standards, nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, built to carry a full complement of fighters, marines, and heavy weapons batteries. It was, by any reasonable measure the Concord had ever used, an intimidating warship. The vessel now approaching them measured just under 9 kilometers in length. Ilkarn read the final measurements aloud in a flat, careful voice, the voice of someone trying very hard not to let fear creep into her tone in front of the rest of the bridge crew. The ship's hull was dark, angular, built from a material that absorbed most of the fleet's active sensor pulses rather than reflecting them cleanly, which was part of why the earlier passive readings had been so difficult to resolve. Weapon emplacements dotted its surface in numbers that made Ilkarn's threat assessment routine struggle to produce a clean count, the system flagging dozens of possible weapon signatures before finally giving up and simply reporting more than could be reliably identified from this range. Kovith stood very still at the tactical station, staring at the image now fully rendered on the main display. The ship's shape was not elegant, not built with the kind of smooth, sweeping lines the Concord favored in its own capital ships. It was blunt, heavy, almost brutal in its design, built for one purpose and one purpose only. It did not look like a ship meant to explore, or to trade, or to impress anyone with its beauty. It looked like a ship built entirely around the singular idea of surviving anything thrown at it, while ensuring that whatever had thrown it did not survive the exchange. Kovith had commanded fleets before that faced enemies with more ships, more numbers, more raw manpower than his own forces. He had never once, in his entire career, faced a single vessel that made every ship under his command feel small in comparison. He found himself doing the math without meaning to, comparing the Varanthe's own modest 2 kilometers to the 9 kilometers now filling more and more of his main display as the range continued to close. The Dauntless was not simply larger. It was larger in a way that made the difference feel less like a matter of degree and more like a matter of kind, as though the humans had built something that did not belong in the same category of vessel as anything the Concord had ever produced. Ilkarn continued reading off details as her instruments slowly refined their picture of the approaching ship, her voice growing quieter with each new figure. The hull plating alone, based on the density readings her sensors were returning, appeared to be composed of layered armor unlike anything in the Concord's own records, alternating bands of some dense metallic compound with what looked like energy-dispersing fields built directly into the structure itself, rather than projected outward the way Concord's shield technology worked. It was, as far as Ilkarn could tell, not a ship that relied on a single shield generator that could be knocked out with a well-placed strike. It was a ship built so that every part of its hull could, in theory, absorb and disperse an attack on its own. "Commander," Ilkarn said quietly, not looking away from her display, "I'm reading heat signatures consistent with active weapon systems along almost the entire length of the hull. Dozens of separate emplacements. Possibly more than 100, though my systems can't get a clean count through whatever they're using to mask their exact configuration." Threll, standing near the main viewport, said nothing, but Kovith noticed the young officer's hand tighten slightly on the railing in front of him. Around the bridge, other officers had gone quiet in the same way, the kind of silence that came not from discipline, but from a shared, unspoken understanding that something had just changed, fundamentally, in what any of them believed they understood about the galaxy they lived in. A single line of text scrolled across the bottom of Ilkarn's display as the ship's identification finally resolved, picked up from a low-power transponder signal the vessel was broadcasting, seemingly without any concern for who might read it. Utedda Vessel Dauntless. One ship, said Koveth, second in command, a younger officer named Threll, standing near the main viewport with an expression Koveth had never seen on his face before. They sent one ship to meet a fleet of 22. Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. The silence on the bridge said everything that needed to be said. Koveth forced himself to think clearly, to fall back on decades of military training rather than the growing sense of dread building in his chest. A single ship, however large, however heavily armed, could still theoretically be overwhelmed by numbers, if it came down to a direct engagement. 22 Concord warships, coordinating their fire, could in theory bring down almost any single target given enough time and enough willingness to accept losses. The question was not whether the Dauntless could eventually be destroyed by sheer weight of numbers. The question was how many of his own ships, and how many of his own people, would be destroyed first, and whether the cost would be worth whatever answer the encounter provided. "Hold formation," Koveth ordered, his voice steady despite everything. "Full stop. Do not advance any further until I understand what we're dealing with." The fleet slowed and came to a halt roughly 200,000 kilometers from the Dauntless, well within weapons range for most Concord ships, though Koveth had no idea, looking at the strange blunt shape on his display, what the effective range of the human vessel's weapons might actually be. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The Dauntless continued its slow approach at a steady, unhurried pace, neither speeding up nor slowing down, its weapons emplacements, as far as Ilkarn's sensors could tell, not yet active or targeting anything. Then, a communication request appeared on the Voranthe's bridge, originating from the Dauntless. Koveth accepted it immediately. The figure that appeared on the screen was a human male, middle-aged, with short gray hair, and a calm, unreadable expression that reminded Koveth uncomfortably of Ambassador Nandan's demeanor during their earlier meeting. He wore a dark uniform, simple and unadorned, and behind him Koveth could see a section of the Dauntless's bridge, crewed by dozens of humans moving calmly through their stations, none of them showing any sign of alarm at facing a fleet more than 20 times the size of their own vessel. "Fleet Commander Koveth," the man said, his voice translated a moment later into Voraki by the Voranthe's systems. "I'm Captain Elias Marrow, commanding officer of the Utedda Dauntless. I've been asked to deliver a message on behalf of the Terran Defense Authority." Koveth kept his voice as steady as he could manage. "I am listening, Captain. Ambassador Nandan negotiated a boundary agreement with you several months ago," Marrow said. "That agreement has not yet been formally ratified by your council, and in the meantime, your government has chosen to send 22 warships into our territory, along a projected course that would bring you directly toward inhabited human systems within another 2 weeks. I've been ordered to inform you that this fleet will not be permitted to continue further into Terran space." Koveth chose his next words carefully, aware that every officer on his bridge was listening closely to how he handled this exchange. "Captain, this fleet was sent as a demonstration of the Concord's continued interest in reaching a fair and lasting agreement with your government. It was not sent with hostile intent." Marrow's expression did not change. "Commander, with respect, 22 warships is not how a species demonstrates peaceful intent to a government it has already had 2 hostile encounters with in the past year. I understand this may be standard practice for the Concord when dealing with less developed species. I'm telling you clearly, so there's no confusion later, that it is not going to work the way you expect it to work here." There was a long pause on the bridge of the Voranthe. Koveth was acutely aware of Threll standing nearby, of Ilkarn at her station, of dozens of other officers watching him, waiting to see how their commander would respond to being spoken to this way by the captain of a single ship, however large that ship might be. "What would you have us do, Captain?" Koveth asked finally. "Turn your fleet around," Marrow said. "Return to Concord space. Instruct your council to ratify the boundary agreement Ambassador Nandan negotiated, in full, without further attempts to test our defenses or intimidate our government with shows of force. If you do this, I have been authorized to allow your fleet to withdraw without further incident. And if we do not? Koveth asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. Marrow's expression remained calm, almost gentle, in a way that somehow made his next words more unsettling rather than less. Then I'll do what I came here to do, Commander. I'd genuinely rather not. I don't think you understand yet what that would mean, and I don't think you'll believe me if I try to explain it to you now. So I'm asking you, one commander to another, to make the right choice here. Turn your fleet around. The transmission ended a moment later, the screen returning to the tactical display showing the massive shape of the Dauntless still holding its position, patient, unmoving, waiting for Koveth's answer. For a long moment Koveth said nothing, staring at the display, weighing everything he had learned about this species over the past several months against the humiliation of returning to the Concord Council having been turned back by a single ship. He thought about the wars in humanity's own history, the weapons capable of destroying entire cities, the strange, grim resilience that had allowed them to survive their own worst instincts for generation after generation. He thought about Ambassador Nandan's tired, calm confidence, and now Captain Marrow's, both of them speaking with the same unshakable certainty that they knew exactly what they were doing. He also thought about the Concord Council, about the Krathis representative who had argued so forcefully for a strong response, about the political cost of returning home with nothing to show for this mission but another warning. Across the fleet, on the bridges of the other 21 Concord warships, captains and crews watched the same standoff play out on their own displays, waiting for Koveth's decision to reach them. Aboard the Kelmeth, the same escort ship that had accompanied Koveth to the earlier diplomatic meeting, its captain, a steady older officer named Vorik Athnel, stared at the image of the Dauntless with a growing sense of unease that mirrored what Koveth himself was feeling. Athnel had been present during the earlier meeting with Ambassador Nandan, had heard her calm, unshaken warnings firsthand, and he found himself hoping, quietly, that Koveth would remember those warnings now. On several of the Krathis vessels attached to the fleet, the reaction was different. The Krathis had joined this mission eager to prove the strength of the Concord's combined military, and many of their officers viewed the size of the Dauntless not as a warning to be heeded, but as a challenge to be met. A young Krathis captain named Doric Vash sent a private message to Koveth's flagship, requesting permission to bring his own ship's weapons online, ahead of the rest of the fleet, arguing that a single vessel, however large, could not possibly withstand a coordinated strike from 22 ships firing in unison. Koveth denied the request, ordering every ship to hold position and wait for his signal, unwilling to let a single overeager captain provoke an engagement before he had exhausted every other option. But even as he gave that order, Koveth understood, with a growing sense of dread, that he was quickly running out of other options. Marrow's warning had been clear. Nandan's warning months earlier had been clear, and yet the political reality waiting for him back at Voraki Prime was equally clear. An unforgiving weight that pressed against every instinct, telling him to turn the fleet around and accept whatever damage to his own reputation that decision might cause. Threll approached him quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only Koveth could hear him. "Commander, if we turn back now, the Council will see it as a failure. They may relieve you of command." Koveth knew this was almost certainly true. He also knew, with a growing certainty that felt like ice settling into his chest, that Marrow had not been bluffing, not for a single moment during their entire conversation. Everything about the man's calm, patient demeanor had matched exactly the pattern Koveth had already begun to recognize in this species. They did not make threats they could not back up. They simply stated facts, plainly, and gave their opponents every opportunity to avoid the consequences those facts described. But a fleet commander's career, and even a fleet commander's life, mattered less than the reputation of the entire Concord military. If word spread across 1,000 worlds that 22 Concord warships had turned and fled from a single vessel without firing a single shot, the damage to Concord prestige across the galaxy could be catastrophic, far beyond anything that happened here today. Other species, watching from the borders, would see weakness where they had always seen strength before. Old rivals within the Concord itself might begin to question Voraki military leadership entirely. Koveth stood at the center of his bridge for a long, terrible moment, caught between what his instincts were screaming at him to do and what he feared his duty required of him. Finally, he turned to Threll, his voice quiet but firm. "Signal the fleet," he said. "Prepare for a coordinated strike. All ships, target the Dauntless simultaneously. Full weapons range, on my mark." Threll hesitated for just a moment before relaying the order, and Koveth caught the flicker of doubt in his second-in-command's eyes, the same doubt he felt gripping his own chest. But the order had been given, and across 22 Concord warships, weapons systems began powering up, targeting locks, slowly acquiring the massive, patient shape of the human vessel, still holding its position at the center of the corridor. On the bridge of the Dauntless, Captain Marrow watched the Concord fleet's weapons signatures begin to spike across his own tactical display, and let out a slow, quiet breath. "They're going for it," Commander Tull said beside him, her voice tight but controlled. Marrow nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the display, on the 22 ships preparing to open fire on his own vessel. "I was hoping they wouldn't," he said quietly. "I really was." He straightened in his chair, his voice shifting, becoming the steady, clear voice of a captain giving orders to a crew he trusted completely, a crew that had trained for exactly this moment for years, without ever quite believing it would come. "All hands battle stations," Marrow said. "Bring the Dauntless to full combat readiness. Primary defense grid online. Weapons free the moment they open fire, not before." The Dauntless had been laid down almost 16 years earlier, in the years immediately following an event that most ordinary citizens across the Terran systems still did not fully understand. An event that only a small number of senior officials, scientists, and military commanders had ever seen the complete records of. Humanity had come within a hair's breadth of extinction once already, not from an alien invasion, but from its own hand, during the final, terrible years of a conflict fought entirely between different factions of Terrans themselves. A war that had used weapons capable of erasing cities in an instant, and had very nearly escalated into something that would have erased the species along with them. In the aftermath, a quiet resolve had settled over what remained of humanity's leadership, a resolve that had shaped every decision made in the decades that followed. Never again would humanity allow itself to be caught unprepared, not by its own worst instincts, and not by anything that might come from beyond its own solar system. The Terran Defense Authority had been built from that resolve, funded quietly and consistently across generations of leadership who might have disagreed on almost everything else, but who agreed completely on this one point. And the Dauntless, along with a small handful of sister vessels still under construction in hidden shipyards scattered across human territory, had been the ultimate expression of that resolve. A ship built not to conquer, not to expand, but to make absolutely certain that humanity would never again find itself standing defenseless in front of an overwhelming threat. Marrow had commanded the ship for the past 4 years, through countless drills and simulations, through the long, patient wait for a moment that he had genuinely hoped, in some private part of himself, might never actually come. He had trained his crew relentlessly, not because he expected to lose, but because he understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what it would mean if the Dauntless were ever called upon and found wanting. Now, watching 22 Concord warships bring their weapons online across his tactical display, he found himself hoping, one final time, that Koveth would reconsider. He thought, briefly, of his own grandfather, who had survived the final years of the old conflict as a young man, who had told Marrow stories as a child about cities that had simply ceased to exist overnight, about the long, hard decades that followed, spent rebuilding not just cities and infrastructure, but the basic trust between people who had so recently been willing to destroy each other completely. His grandfather had never wanted Marrow to join the military. He had wanted, more than anything, for his grandson to live in a world where such a career was never necessary again. Marrow had joined anyway, because he understood something his grandfather, in his old age, sometimes seemed to forget. That peace, real peace, was not something that simply happened on its own. It was something that had to be defended, deliberately and without apology, by people willing to stand in front of it when necessary. The hope did not last long. Across the ship, alarms began to sound, and 9 kilometers of dark, patient steel began, for the first time in its existence, to wake fully into what it had always been built to become. Deep within the Dauntless, in compartments most of the crew rarely thought about during their daily routines, massive reactor cores that had been idling at a fraction of their true output for the entire journey began spinning up toward full capacity. Power surged through kilometers of conduits, feeding weapon systems that had sat dormant, waiting, for years. Along the ship's hull, panels that had appeared, to the Voranthes sensors, to be nothing more than dark, featureless armor plating began sliding open, one after another, revealing weapon emplacements that had been deliberately masked from view until the exact moment they were needed. In the ship's forward gunnery section, a young weapons officer named Petty Officer Nakamura watched her console light up with targeting data, dozens of separate firing solutions calculating themselves against the 22 Concorde ships now spread across the Dauntless's tactical display. She had trained for this moment more times than she could count, in simulations that had always felt, on some level, like games, exercises without any real weight behind them. This did not feel like a game. Her hands were steady on her controls, years of discipline holding back the tremor she could feel building somewhere beneath her calm exterior, but her heart was pounding harder than it ever had during any drill. Firing solutions locked across all primary batteries, she reported, her voice carrying clearly across the gunnery deck. Standing by. On the bridge, Commander Tull watched the same tactical display Marrow was studying, her jaw tight, her eyes moving steadily across the spread of Concorde warships, now fully committed to their attack formation. "They're not backing down, Captain." "No," Marrow agreed quietly. "They're not." He watched the last few seconds tick away on his display, the Concorde fleet's weapons systems reaching full charge, the moment of decision arriving whether anyone aboard either fleet was truly ready for it or not. Somewhere behind him, he was aware of his crew holding their breath collectively, the entire ship poised on the edge of something that would, in the span of the next few minutes, change everything either side believed about the balance of power in this part of the galaxy. "Steady," Marrow said quietly to his crew, to himself, to 9 kilometers of steel and fire waiting patiently in the dark. Let them fire first. He did not have to wait long. The order to fire reached all 22 Concorde warships within the same second, and for a brief, terrible moment, space between the two fleets lit up with the combined weapons fire of the entire Concorde force. Plasma cannons, energy lances, and heavy kinetic batteries all opened fire at once. A storm of destructive force converging on the single, massive shape of the Dauntless from every angle across the formation. Aboard the Voranthe, Koveth watched his tactical display fill with the projected paths of his fleet's combined firepower. Decades of military instinct telling him that no single vessel, however well armored, however advanced, could survive a barrage of this scale without serious damage. For just a moment, as the weapons fire streaked across the darkness toward its target, something like hope flickered in his chest. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps the fear that had been building in him for months had made him see a threat greater than what truly existed. That hope did not survive contact with what happened next. The Dauntless's defense grid activated a fraction of a second before the first shots arrived, a shimmering field of energy that Koveth's sensors struggled to properly categorize, unlike any shield technology the Concorde had ever encountered. Rather than forming a single uniform barrier around the entire ship, the field seemed to react locally, strengthening precisely where incoming fire was about to strike, leaving other sections of the hull almost unprotected in the same instant. It was, Ilkarn would later try to explain in her official report, as though the ship's defenses knew exactly where every single shot was going to land before it arrived, and adjusted accordingly, wasting no energy protecting areas that were never actually under threat. Most of the fleet's combined barrage struck the shimmering field and dispersed harmlessly, absorbed and scattered across the Dauntless's hull in bursts of light that lit up the darkness around the massive vessel like a brief, silent storm. A handful of shots, fired from angles the defense grid had apparently judged less urgent, struck the ship's outer armor directly, and even then, the damage was minimal, scorch marks and small craters appearing across sections of hull plating that had clearly been designed to absorb exactly this kind of punishment, without any meaningful loss of structural integrity. When the barrage ended, The Dauntless was still there, unmoving, apparently undamaged in any way that mattered. "Report," Koveth said, his voice tight, though he already suspected what Ilkarn was about to tell him. "Minimal damage detected, Commander," Ilkarn said, her voice carrying a note of disbelief she could not fully hide. Their shields absorbed almost the entire barrage. What got through did not penetrate their armor in any significant way. On the bridge of the Dauntless, Marrow watched the tactical display clear, as the last of the Concord fleet's weapons fire dispersed against his ship's defense grid, and felt a grim, quiet certainty settle over him. He had hoped, until the very last second, that this moment would not come. Now that it had, there was no more room for hesitation. "Return fire," he said, his voice calm and steady, carrying easily across the bridge. "Target their formation. Petty Officer Nakamura, you have weapons free." Nakamura's hands moved across her console with practiced precision, years of training taking over as the moment of doubt that had gripped her earlier fell away entirely, replaced by pure focus. "Firing," she said, and along the length of the Dauntless's hull, dozens of weapon emplacements that had spent the entire encounter charging in near silence finally released their built-up power in a single, coordinated strike. The weapons the Dauntless carried were unlike anything the Concorde had built into its own arsenal. Rather than the plasma cannons and energy lances favored across Concorde military doctrine, the human ship fired concentrated bursts of directed kinetic energy, accelerated to speeds that made them almost impossible for Concorde point defense systems to intercept, each strike carrying enough raw force to punch through even heavily armored Concorde hull plating in a single hit. The weapons were also, Ilkarn noted with growing horror as she tracked the incoming fire, extraordinarily precise, each burst seemingly aimed not at the general mass of a target ship, but at very specific, critical systems, engine cores, weapons batteries, command sections. The first strikes hit two of the Krathis vessels attached to the fleet, the same ships whose captain had been eager to prove Concorde's strength only minutes earlier. Both ships lost main power within seconds of impact, their weapons and shield systems going dark simultaneously, leaving them drifting helplessly in space as secondary explosions rippled across their hulls. A third strike hit the Kelmith, Captain Athnel's escort vessel, tearing through its engine section and leaving the ship crippled, tumbling slowly out of formation. Koveth watched the destruction unfold across his tactical display with a growing, sick certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. He ordered the fleet to break formation, to spread out and present a more difficult target, hoping to reduce the effectiveness of the Dauntless's precise, devastating fire. It did not help. The human ship's weapons continued finding their marks with the same terrible accuracy, striking one Concorde vessel after another, disabling engines, destroying weapons batteries, tearing through shield generators that had never been designed to withstand this level of concentrated, precise firepower. Aboard the Krathis vessel that had first requested permission to open fire early, young Captain Doric Vash watched his own ship's systems fail one by one, as a second strike from the Dauntless tore through the hull near the bridge itself. The lights on the bridge flickered and died, emergency systems kicking in a moment later, casting the chaos in dim red light. Vash felt the ship shudder beneath him, heard the screams of crew members thrown from their stations by the force of the impact, and understood, in the last clear moment of thought before the ship's damaged systems forced an emergency evacuation, that everything he had believed about Concorde military superiority had been catastrophically, fatally wrong. He survived. Not all of his crew did. Aboard one of the other disabled Concorde vessels, a supply and support ship called the Marinth, that had never been designed for frontline combat at all, a young engineer named Solvi Kren crouched in a darkened maintenance corridor, trying to seal a ruptured coolant line before it could flood the section with toxic fumes. The ship had lost main power in the opening seconds of the human counterattack, one of the first strikes tearing through its lightly armored hull near the engine core. Kren had never fought in a real battle before. He had joined the Concorde's engineering corps because he was good with machines, not because he had any particular taste for war, and as he worked in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of chaos elsewhere in the ship, he found himself thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that he might not survive the next hour. He did survive in the end, along with most of the Marinth's crew, though the ship itself would never fly again without a complete rebuild. But the fear he felt in that dark corridor, The sudden, total collapse of every assumption he had ever held about the safety of serving in the Concorde military stayed with him long after the physical danger had passed. He would tell the story, years later, to younger engineers just joining the fleet, always ending it the same way. That was the day I understood we were not as strong as we had always believed ourselves to be. Not every ship in the fleet was as fortunate as the Marinth. The heavy cruiser Dorothy Van, one of the 4 vessels ultimately destroyed outright, took a direct hit to its main reactor core less than 4 minutes into the engagement. The resulting explosion tore the ship apart from the inside, and of its crew of nearly 300 Voraki, fewer than 40 made it to escape pods in time. Koveth would read the casualty reports later that night, alone in his quarters, and would find himself unable to finish reading all of the names. Throughout the engagement, the Dauntless continued its methodical, almost surgical work, its weapons finding one target after another with a precision that seemed less like skill and more like something closer to inevitability. Ilkarn, watching from the Voranthi's tactical station, began to notice a pattern in how the human ship chose its targets, one that troubled her almost as much as the destruction itself. The Dauntless was not simply firing at whatever presented the easiest shot. It was disabling ships rather than destroying them wherever possible, targeting engines and weapon systems on vessels it could have easily obliterated entirely, reserving its most lethal, concentrated fire for ships that continued actively engaging it, even after taking damage. "Commander," she said quietly, during a brief lull as the Dauntless repositioned itself between targets, "I don't think they're trying to kill us. I think they're trying to stop us." Koveth had noticed the same thing, though he had not yet found the words to describe what it meant. A species with a weapon capable of this level of devastation, choosing, even in the middle of active combat, to minimize the loss of life where it could. It was a kind of restraint he had not expected to see in the middle of a battle, and it unsettled him almost as deeply as the raw destructive power itself. It meant that everything Marrow and Nandan had told him about choice, about restraint being available and simply not always exercised, had been true even here, even now, in the middle of the worst violence he had witnessed in his entire military career. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 11 minutes from the moment the Concorde fleet opened fire to the moment Koveth finally gave the order to withdraw. In that time, 4 Concorde warships were destroyed outright, their hulls torn apart by the Dauntless's precise, overwhelming fire. 8 more were left disabled, drifting helplessly, unable to defend themselves or continue the fight. The remaining 10, including Koveth's own flagship, had sustained varying degrees of damage, enough that continuing the engagement any further would have meant near certain destruction for the entire fleet. Throughout the battle, the Dauntless itself had sustained almost no meaningful damage at all. A handful of shots had managed to penetrate its defense grid in the chaos of the engagement, scorching sections of hull plating and causing minor damage to a few external sensor arrays, but nothing that came close to threatening the ship's ability to continue fighting indefinitely if it had chosen to. Koveth stood on the bridge of the Voranthe, watching the wreckage of nearly half his fleet drift silently in space around him, and felt something inside him break that he suspected would never fully mend. He thought of Athnel aboard the crippled Kelmeth, of Vash and the wounded crew of the Kratha's vessel, of all the officers and soldiers under his command who had trusted him to lead them safely through this mission. He had led them, instead, into a slaughter that could have been avoided entirely if he had simply listened to the warnings he had been given, over and over, by people who had never once lied to him about what would happen if he did not. He opened a channel to the Dauntless, his voice hollow as he spoke. "Captain Marrow, we are withdrawing. I am ordering my fleet to retreat from this system immediately." There was a pause before Marrow's response came through, and when it did, his voice carried none of the triumph or satisfaction Koveth might have expected from a commander who had just won such a decisive victory. Instead, it sounded almost tired and, strangely, sympathetic. "Understood, Commander," Marrow said. "I won't pursue your ships as you withdraw, and I'll allow your disabled vessels time to recover their crews before I move to secure this area. I am sorry it came to this. I genuinely am, but I hope you understand now why it had to." Koveth did not respond immediately. He looked out at the wreckage surrounding his fleet, at the 4 Concorde warships that would never return home, at the 8 more that would need to be towed back across the border for repairs that would take months. at the 10 remaining ships bearing scars that would take even longer to fully heal. He thought about everything Nandan and Marrow had both told him, in their own separate ways, about a species that did not make threats it could not back up, that had chosen restraint again and again, not out of weakness, but because restraint had always been a choice available to them, one they had exercised freely, right up until the moment the Concorde had left them no other option. "I understand, Captain," Koveth said finally, his voice quiet. "I understand completely." He gave the order for the fleet to withdraw, and one by one, the surviving Concorde warships began the slow, painful process of gathering their wounded and dying, of collecting the drifting hulks of their disabled companions, and turning back toward the border they had crossed, with such confidence only days earlier. As the fleet limped away from the battle site, Koveth remained on the bridge of the Varantha long after most of his crew had been dismissed to attend to the ship's own damage and the care of its wounded. He stood alone at the main viewport, staring out at the darkness where the Dauntless had finally faded from sensor range, a single ship that had, in less than 11 minutes, ended any illusion the Concorde had ever held about its place at the top of the galaxy's hierarchy of power. The journey back to the border took nearly a month, far longer than the fleet's original approach, slowed by the need to keep pace with the most heavily damaged vessels and by the constant work of the engineering crews, trying to keep those same ships from breaking apart entirely before they could reach a proper repair yard. Koveth spent much of that month moving between ships, visiting the wounded in the Voranthi's medical bay, and later, once the fleet had regrouped enough to allow it, sending shuttles to check on the crews of the other damaged vessels as well. He met Captain Athnel in person for the first time since the battle roughly 2 weeks into the return journey, once the Kelmeth had been stabilized enough to allow safe transit between ships. Athnel had lost 11 crew members when the human strike tore through the Kelmeth's engine section, and he looked, when Koveth found him in a quiet corner of his ship's damaged command deck, like a man who had aged years in the span of a single battle. "I keep thinking about what she told us," Athnel said quietly, not needing to specify who he meant. Both of them had been present for Ambassador Nandan's warning months earlier. "She told us exactly what would happen, Commander. She told us, and we still didn't believe her." Koveth had no comforting words to offer, because he had none to offer himself. "I gave the order to fire," he said instead. "The failure to listen was mine before it was anyone else's. I will make sure the Council understands that, when I make my report." Athnel shook his head slowly. "The Council will hear what they want to hear, Commander. You know that as well as I do. Some of them will call this a tragedy. Others will call it an insult that demands a stronger response next time. I don't know which is worse." Koveth did not know either, and the thought stayed with him for the rest of the journey home. A quiet, persistent dread that the true danger to the Concorde might not come from the Terrans at all, but from his own government's inability to accept what had happened here, to learn from it rather than seeking to avenge it. He thought about the report he would have to send back to the Council, about how he would explain the loss of 4 ships and the crippling of 8 more to a single enemy vessel, about how he would convince a council that had never truly believed the Terrans posed a genuine threat, that they had, in fact, been facing a species capable of ending the entire Concorde military if it ever chose to stop showing restraint. He did not know, yet, whether anyone back home would truly believe him. He suspected, with a grim certainty that settled deep into his chest, that they would not believe him at all, not until they saw the wreckage of his fleet with their own eyes, and perhaps not even then. Aboard the Dauntless, the mood on the bridge was far from triumphant. Marrow watched the last of the Concorde fleet's wreckage and disabled ships slowly withdraw from the system, gathered his crew's attention with a brief, quiet word, and ordered a full damage assessment, even though he already knew the ship had come through the engagement almost entirely intact. Commander Tull moved through the bridge, checking on individual crew members as the adrenaline of the past 11 minutes began to fade, replaced by the particular kind of exhaustion that came after a battle, rather than during one. Nakamura remained at her station long after the last shot had been fired, staring at her console, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the immediate demands of the engagement no longer required them to be steady. She had disabled and destroyed more enemy vessels in the past 11 minutes than most soldiers in human history had ever faced in their entire careers, and the weight of that reality was only now beginning to settle over her. Marrow noticed, and crossed the bridge to stand beside her for a moment, saying nothing, simply letting his presence be a quiet acknowledgement of what she had just done and what it had cost her, even in victory. "You did exactly what you were trained to do," he said finally, his voice low. "You kept casualties lower than they could have been. That matters." Nakamura nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Mero moved on, checking in with the rest of his crew in turn, before finally returning to his own chair and opening a secure channel back to Admiral Ibarra at New Series. The message would take some time to reach her across the distance, but he recorded it anyway, wanting the report filed while the details were still fresh and clear in his mind. "Admiral," he said, "the Concorde fleet engaged us as anticipated. We have neutralized the immediate threat with minimal damage to the Dauntless, and no casualties among our crew. 4 enemy vessels destroyed, 8 disabled, 10 damaged and withdrawing. I want to be clear in this report that the Concorde commander showed genuine hesitation before engaging, and I believe, based on our communication before the battle, that political pressure from his own government left him with little real choice in the matter. I don't believe this is over, Admiral. I believe what happens next depends entirely on whether their leadership is capable of learning from what happened here today, or whether they'll see this as an insult that demands an even larger response. Recommend we prepare accordingly. Dauntless out." He closed the channel and sat quietly for a long moment, watching the empty space where the Concorde fleet had been, thinking about Kovith's tired, defeated voice during their final exchange, and hoping, without much real confidence, that the coming weeks would prove his caution unnecessary. Kovith's report reached the Concorde Council 4 days after his battered fleet finally crossed back over the border into Concorde space. He delivered it in person, standing once again at the center of the same circular chamber, where he had first raised concerns about the Terrans nearly a year earlier, though this time the mood in the room was very different from the curious, mildly dismissive atmosphere of that first meeting. He laid out the facts plainly, the way he always did. 22 ships sent, 4 destroyed, 8 disabled, 10 damaged. A single human vessel, 9 kilometers in length, responsible for all of it, having sustained almost no meaningful damage in return. He did not soften the details, and he did not attempt to shift blame away from his own decision to give the order to fire. He told the council exactly what Ambassador Nandon and Captain Mero had both told him, on separate occasions, about restraint being a choice the Terrans had made repeatedly, right up until the moment the Concorde had left them no other option. The reaction in the chamber was exactly as divided as Kovith had feared it would be. The Krathi's representative who had argued so forcefully for a strong response months earlier now argued, with equal force, that the Concorde could not allow this defeat to stand unanswered, that a larger fleet, drawing on resources from across the entire Concorde, needed to be assembled to properly punish the Terrans for what had happened. Several other member species, alarmed by the scale of the losses, echoed similar sentiments, unable to accept that a single ship from a species they had considered primitive only a year earlier could have inflicted this kind of damage without some deeper trick or deception being involved. But there were other voices in the chamber as well, quieter at first, growing louder as the debate continued. The Dren representative who had questioned Kovith's original findings months earlier now rose to speak with a different kind of caution in his voice. "Commander Kovith has given us a clear, honest account of what happened," the Dren said. "He has told us that this species offered peace, repeatedly, through official channels, before ever resorting to force. He has told us that even in the middle of active combat, their commander chose to disable, rather than destroy, wherever it was possible to do so. I would ask this council to consider carefully what kind of species we are truly dealing with here, before we make a decision that costs us far more than 22 ships." The debate stretched across 3 full days of council session, longer than any single issue had been debated in Kovith's entire memory of serving under Concorde military command. Kovith was called back to the chamber several times to answer further questions, some of them hostile, from council members who seemed determined to find some flaw in his account that would justify the response they had already decided they wanted. He answered each question as honestly as he could, refusing to exaggerate the Terran threat and refusing just as firmly to minimize it. At one point, late on the second day of debate, the Krathis representative pressed him directly. "Commander, is it not possible that this single vessel represented the very limit of Terran military capability? that having deployed their strongest weapon and won, they now have nothing left to threaten us with, should we return in greater force. Koveth considered the question carefully before answering. It is possible, Representative. I cannot rule it out entirely, but I would remind this council that the vessel we encountered was not hastily built in response to our approach. Ambassador Nandan's warnings, given to us more than a year before this battle took place, described capabilities we chose not to believe existed. I do not think it is wise to assume the worst of our own judgment has already been proven wrong, and yet continue trusting that same judgment now, when the stakes are so much higher. The chamber had gone quiet at that, and Koveth felt, for the first time since the battle, that his words had actually reached some of the council members who had previously seemed committed to a harsher response. In the end, the vote was close, closer than Koveth had expected given how loudly the voices calling for retaliation had spoken. But it went, in the final count, toward caution rather than escalation. The council authorized no further military action against Terran territory. Instead, it authorized a formal diplomatic delegation, led by a senior civilian representative rather than any military commander, to travel to the boundary and formally ratify the agreement Ambassador Nandan had negotiated more than a year earlier, the same agreement the Concord had ignored, in favor of a show of force that had cost so many lives. Koveth was not placed in command of the delegation. His military career, in the aftermath of the battle, would never fully recover its previous trajectory, though he was not, as Threll had once feared, relieved of duty entirely. He was reassigned, eventually, to an advisory role within Concord Military Intelligence, where his hard-earned understanding of Terran history and psychology proved more valuable than any battlefield command he might have held instead. He spent the following years studying every scrap of information the Concord could gather about humanity, and slowly, carefully, helped shape a new generation of Concord policy toward the Terrans, one built on caution and respect, rather than the old assumptions that had cost so many lives. The diplomatic delegation that finally traveled to the boundary was met, once again, by Ambassador Priya Nandan, along with a small support team from the Terran Defense Authority. The negotiations that followed were long and often difficult, but they were conducted, this time, in good faith on both sides. Nandan did not gloat over the Concord's defeat, and the Concord delegation did not attempt to disguise the losses they had suffered or minimize what had happened. Both sides understood, by this point, exactly what was at stake if the relationship between their two powers were allowed to sour into open, sustained conflict. The final agreement, ratified almost 18 months after the battle in the Intercept Corridor, established humanity as a fully independent power, recognized by the Concord as an equal, rather than a future member species, awaiting eventual absorption. A clear boundary was established, with agreed protocols for any future contact or trade between the two powers. Neither side fully trusted the other, not yet, and perhaps not for generations to come, but a foundation had been laid, one built on the hard, painful lessons of a battle that neither side would ever fully forget. Word of the encounter spread slowly across the wider galaxy in the years that followed, carried through trade routes and diplomatic channels, growing more exaggerated with each retelling the way such stories always did. Other species along the Concord's borders, species who had long assumed that Concord military strength was simply an unshakable fact of galactic life, began to look at their own relationships with the Concord a little differently, understanding now that even the mighty Voraki fleet could be humbled by a single determined opponent who simply refused to be intimidated. Within human territory, the Dauntless became something of a quiet legend, though the full details of the battle remained classified for many years, known only to those with the proper clearance within the Terran Defense Authority. Captain Marrow continued to command the ship for another 6 years, overseeing a handful of smaller encounters along the boundary with the Concord, none of which ever escalated into anything approaching the scale of that first battle. He retired eventually, older, quieter, carrying the weight of that single, terrible engagement with him for the rest of his life, though he never once expressed regret for the choice he had made that day. On the day of his retirement ceremony, held quietly aboard the Dauntless itself, surrounded by a crew that had mostly changed over in the 6 years since the battle, Marrow was asked by a young officer, barely more than a cadet, what it had felt like in those final moments before the Concord fleet opened fire, waiting to see whether diplomacy would hold, or whether he would be forced to use the terrible power under his command. Marrow considered the question for a long time before answering, choosing his words as carefully as he always had. It felt like standing at the edge of something I had spent my whole career hoping I would never actually have to do, he said. I want you to understand something, all of you, because I think it matters more than anything else I could tell you about that day. Winning was never something to be proud of. We didn't win because we were stronger, though we were. We won because we had already suffered enough, generations ago, to understand exactly what real strength requires. It requires knowing when to hold back as much as it requires knowing when to act. If any of you ever find yourselves standing where I stood that day, I hope you remember that the goal was never to prove we could destroy them. The goal was only ever to make sure nobody else had to lose what we had already lost, a long time before any of you were born. The young officer never forgot those words, and carried them forward into her own career in the years that followed, long after Marrow had left the ship for the last time, and returned to a quiet life on Earth, spending his remaining years exactly where his grandfather had always hoped he might end up eventually, far from any battlefield, tending a small garden, telling his own grandchildren stories of a war that, in the end, had never truly needed to happen at all. Admiral Ibarra remained at her post for many more years, overseeing the slow, careful work of building a lasting peace with the Concorde, always mindful of the lesson that first encounter had taught both sides. Strength alone, she often told younger officers during their training, was never enough to guarantee safety. It had to be paired with restraint, with the wisdom to know when force was truly necessary and when it was not, because a species that could not tell the difference was no safer, in the end, than one with no strength at all. Petty Officer Nakamura, the young weapons officer who had fired the first shots of the battle, eventually rose through the ranks to command her own vessel, carrying with her, always, the memory of that first terrible engagement and the lesson it had taught her about the true cost of the power she now commanded. She made it a point, throughout her own career, to train every crew member under her command, not just in how to fight, but in when fighting could still be avoided, remembering Marrow's quiet words to her on the bridge of the Dauntless, in the moments after the battle had ended. Captain Athnell, who had lost 11 of his crew aboard the Kelmuth, chose to leave active military service entirely within a year of the battle, unable to reconcile the weight of that loss with the demands of continued command. He and Koveth remained in contact over the years that followed, meeting occasionally when their paths crossed, two men bound together by a single terrible day neither of them could ever fully set aside. During one such meeting, many years later, at a quiet gathering held on Voraki Prime to mark the anniversary of the formal peace agreement with the Terrans, Athnell asked Koveth a question he had never quite found the courage to ask before. "Do you think we could have avoided it?" he asked. "If you had refused the order to fire, if you had turned the fleet around instead?" Koveth had thought about this question many times over the years, turning it over in his mind during long, sleepless nights. "I have asked myself that question more times than I can count," he admitted. "I believe now that I could have refused. I believe Marrow would have let us withdraw peacefully, exactly as he said he would. I think the cost of that choice, for me personally, would have been steep. My career, certainly. Perhaps worse, depending on how the Council chose to react to a commander who refused a direct order in the field. But I think 11 of your crew would still be alive, Athnell, along with so many others we lost that day. I have made my peace with many things over the years since. I have not entirely made my peace with that one." Athnell said nothing for a long moment, simply nodding slowly, and the two men stood together in silence, watching the lights of Voraki Prime's capital spread out beneath them, both carrying, in their own private way, the full weight of a decision that had changed the course of an entire civilization's relationship with the wider galaxy. As for Fleet Commander Sarn Koveth, he spent the remaining years of his career working quietly to ensure that no future Concorde commander would ever again lead a fleet into a battle they did not fully understand. He wrote extensively, in the years that followed, about the encounter, about the mistake of assuming that a species could be measured by its outward appearance, or by outdated survey data, rather than by the true history and character that shaped it. His writings became required study for young Concorde officers for generations afterward, a permanent reminder of the day the Concorde had learned, at great cost, that the galaxy held forces far beyond anything its long, unbroken string of victories had ever prepared it to face. Somewhere, in the quiet space between the two territories, the boundary marker beacon that had first warned Kovith's scout ship all those years earlier continued to drift silently, still broadcasting its message to any ship that came close enough to hear it. A small, patient reminder of a lesson that had been offered freely, again and again, long before it had finally, tragically, been learned the hard way. And on the rare occasions when a new, unfamiliar ship approached that boundary in the years that followed, its crew would often find themselves receiving a quiet, careful briefing from their commanding officers, a story passed down through Concord military tradition about a single human ship, 9 kilometers of dark, patient steel standing alone against overwhelming odds and proving, in less than 11 minutes, that overwhelming odds meant nothing at all against a species that had already survived the very worst that war could offer, and had simply refused, ever again, to be caught unprepared. Many years later, long after Kovith had retired from active service, a young Voraki officer named Sela Vantrick sat in a training classroom on Voraki Prime, listening to an aging instructor describe the battle that had reshaped Concord military doctrine for an entire generation. Vantrick had heard fragments of the story before, the way most young Concord officers had, whispered and exaggerated in barracks conversations long before it was ever taught formally in any classroom. But sitting there, listening to the full, careful account, drawn from Kovith's own writings, she felt the weight of it settle over her, in a way the rumors never had. "Why did they choose restraint?" she asked, when the instructor finished and opened the room for questions. If they had already won, if their ship was truly as powerful as the records describe, why not simply destroy the entire fleet and be done with it? The instructor, an old officer who had served under Kovith himself during his final years of advisory work, considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because destroying us entirely was never the goal, Cadet. Their entire history, as best as Commander Kovith was able to piece it together, was a history of a species that had come close to destroying itself more than once, and had chosen, every single time, to pull back from that edge, rather than complete the destruction they were capable of. They did not want a war with the Concord. They wanted us to understand that a war with them was not one we could win, so that we would never be tempted to start one in the first place. Restraint, in their eyes, was not a weakness. It was the entire point." Vantrick thought about this for a long time after the class ended, walking alone across the wide, open training grounds where new generations of Concord officers had trained for centuries, preparing for wars against enemies who, more often than not, had simply given up rather than face the full weight of Concord military might. She wondered, as she walked, what it might have felt like to stand on the bridge of the Voranthe that day, watching a single ship refuse to move, refuse to be intimidated, and choosing, in the end, to fight not because it wanted to, but because it had been given no other choice. She thought, too, about the strange, quiet respect that had crept into Kovith's own writings about the Terrans in his later years. Respect for a species that had turned its own violent, painful history into a kind of hard-won wisdom, one that the Concord, for all its centuries of unbroken victories, had never truly needed to learn until that single, terrible day in the dim, empty corridor between two debris fields. Somewhere far across the stars, on the human side of the boundary that Nandan and the Concord delegation had finally, formally agreed upon, a new generation of Terran officers were being trained in much the same way, taught the story of the Dauntless and the battle it had fought, though from a very different angle than the one taught in Concord classrooms. They were taught, above all else, the lesson Admiral Ibarra had spent her final years trying to pass on to every officer she trained, that strength without wisdom was simply another kind of danger, and that the true purpose of the Dauntless, and every ship like it, was never to start wars, but to make absolutely certain that humanity would never again have to fight one it had not chosen for itself. They would be told always to remember that first glimpse, and to understand exactly what it had meant for those who saw it. It had meant that they would not survive if they chose to test that patience again. But it had also meant something else, something that took longer for either side to fully understand. It had meant that peace, once it was finally built between two such different powers, might actually be allowed to last, because both sides now understood, in the deepest and most painful way possible, Exactly what the alternative would cost them.